Welcome back, friends, to your Techhandy channel. Please like and subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon to timely get new video updates. In this presentation, we'll define and examine the Active Directory or AD service, which is a proprietary directory service of Microsoft that runs on Windows Server and is used to manage permissions and control access to resources within the environment. Now, what does that all mean? Well, for starters, as for the directory service aspect, think about any time you might have walked into something like an office building, and you need to know on which floor your destination resides. Well, there should be a directory maybe on the wall in the lobby, or maybe there's an electronic kiosk where you can search by name. But in either case, that's an example of a directory service because it lists the resources and tells you how to access them. That's a fairly simple example, but that's still the basis of any directory service. It maintains a list or a database of all available resources and then manages and controls access to those resources. So, in a Windows Server networking environment, things like users are considered to be objects, and those objects can then access resources, such as shared folders, printers, files, email, and many others. But of course, it can't be set up so that just anyone can access anything. For example, I should not be allowed to access your email. Therefore, access has to be managed and controlled. So, this is one of the primary functions of Active Directory. Now, there are certainly other aspects that we'll come to later on. But as for getting started, without the Active Directory service, controlling and managing access to resources would be almost impossible to do effectively, at least in larger networking environments. Smaller networks such as in a small office or even at home can usually manage without it. But once you get up above maybe 10 to 15 users or computers, Active Directory becomes more and more necessary for proper network management. I mentioned how the Active Directory service manages objects, and I did already mention how users are considered to be among the objects that can be managed. But other objects include groups, which, as their name indicates, are collections of users that typically share some kind of common attribute, such as working in the same department or being tasked with the same project. By grouping them together, things like permission management and access control can be performed much more easily because you can assign permissions to the entire group, and every member of the group receives the same level of access. This can save a tremendous amount of time as compared to managing each user's access level separately. Applications such as databases, intranet sites, administrative utilities, and mobile apps can also be managed so that only the appropriate people have access to the appropriate applications. For example, users in the HR department would likely be the only ones able to access employee records in the payroll application. And devices are objects as well, including all desktop and laptop computers and mobile devices such as tablets and phones. In the case of devices, it's not quite so much about which users can use which type of device, but Active Directory can assign an identity to a device as well, so that if that device is being used in an unauthorized manner, such as when a phone is lost or stolen, Active Directory can identify that particular device so that it can be locked or even wiped, or it can ensure that any given device is not allowed to be used to perform a certain type of task or access a certain resource. Or perhaps the opposite might be true, whereby only that device can be used to access a resource. Now that's up to administration, of course, but those types of tasks depend on the ability to identify a device just as you can identify a user. The Active Directory service actually includes several components and other services that we'll see in just a moment. But the primary component is known as Active Directory Domain Services, which is installed onto at least one server and allows the creation of the database that stores and manages the information about the resources and application data for that environment. It also allows you to define logical structures that we'll also come to shortly. But most notably what's known as the domain, which handles the interaction between users and the resources within that domain, including logging on and authenticating their identities. And it also handles the distribution and application of what are known as group policies, which can be used to configure computers and devices in a consistent manner while preventing users from overriding those settings. For example, administration might require that the Windows firewall be active and that it have a preset configuration in terms of its access rules, which could be defined in a policy. Any device that subsequently receives that policy will have its firewall configured automatically by the policy, and users will not be able to circumvent the configuration. This helps administration to know that the devices they manage are configured correctly and consistently. Benefits of using Active Directory include the ability to organize the structure of all objects and resources in your environment in a hierarchical and intuitive manner, which makes for much easier administration. Built-in redundancy provided you have at least 2 servers hosting a copy of the Active Directory. And those servers, by the way, are known as domain controllers. And it's always recommended that you have at least 2 so that you don't have a single point of failure should one server go down. But when you do have 2 domain controllers, it doesn't matter which one you use to perform your administrative tasks. Anything that is done on one server automatically replicates to the other so that both copies of the database are always consistent. And it doesn't matter how many you have. Any change on any domain controller replicates to all other domain controllers. This in itself also provides flexibility in that any administrator can perform any task from any domain controller. And regardless of how many domain controllers you have and regardless of how many administrators you have, all administration remains centralized because the Active Directory database itself remains consistent across all instances on all domain controllers. As for that hierarchical organizational structure, as mentioned, it begins with the creation of what is known as the domain. Now, this is a logical structure only, meaning that it doesn't really matter where any Active Directory component physically resides. As long as there is network connectivity, a domain could be confined to a single office, or it could span a continent. But its primary purpose is to simply group objects and resources together under the same administrative model. So once you install the Active Directory service onto your first server, you have to specify a domain that you want to create. At that point, the only object within the domain is that server itself, and the only user would be the administrator who is performing the installation. But with that complete, then other computers can join the domain so that they can be administered as well. For example, Windows client devices can be joined, and user accounts can be created so that we as users can access the network resources we need using our own identities. Folders and printers can then be created and shared, applications can be distributed, policies can be defined, and many other resources created and managed. Many domains can be very large as well, with millions of objects and resources. So organizational units or OUs can be created to simplify management within the domain. For example, all users and computers in the same department or in the same location might be placed into an OU. Then something like a group policy can be applied to that OU, which configures all computers consistently and configures the user accounts with the appropriate restrictions to ensure security. But those settings and/or policies might not be applicable to those in other departments or regions. So, you can create as many OUs as you like to help reflect the nature of your organization. And despite how large a single domain can be, larger organizations might need multiple domains to adequately manage the enterprise because a single domain does represent an administrative boundary. So, if perhaps one division has significantly different administrative needs from another, you might need 2 or more domains. In that case, they can still be organized into a hierarchy known as domain trees, whereby you can create a parent domain and many child domains. Each domain is still its own administrative unit, but trust relationships can be configured so that if needed, users in one domain can still access resources in others. And for the largest organizations, multiple trees can be arranged into a forest, which, as its name indicates, is simply a collection of domain trees. Similarly, trusts can be configured across trees as well, so that users in any part of the forest can access resources in any other part. But that's up to administration as well. How you configure your hierarchy is entirely up to you. There are no real rules, but the hierarchy of any given Active Directory structure tends to follow the actual hierarchy of the organization itself. For example, if your company operates out of a single office with all users contained within that office, it's likely that a single domain would suffice. Whereas if you're a multinational organization with many different divisions in many different countries, you might need a forest. The other Active Directory domain services concepts include the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol or LDAP, which is the protocol used by devices and applications to access the Active Directory service. The Global Catalog is the component that tracks all resources across all domains. The schema defines the types of objects that can be created along with the attributes of that object. For example, a user is an object that can be created, and the username is an attribute of that object. Objects are the actual items that have been created. Sites represent the physical networks in use and the connections between them, and they can be used to help manage and control different types of network traffic within the Active Directory. And multi-master replication is the fact that any change can be made on any domain controller and it will replicate to all other domain controllers. In other words, there is no single domain controller that is any different from any other, which, in fact, was the case many years ago, back in the days of Windows NT. There used to be a single primary domain controller, then many backup domain controllers. And while the backup domain controllers did still have the same copies of the database, changes could not be made directly to a backup copy. You could log into a backup domain controller and make a change, but that change request was sent to the primary domain controller where it actually made the change. Then the primary would replicate that change to all backup copies. So the backup domain controllers hosted read-only copies of the database from our perspective. But that is no longer the case. All domain controllers are peers now. So, for any organization running Windows that needs to organize and manage the resources of their network in a centralized and structured manner, Active Directory provides the ability to do exactly that. Hope you enjoyed this video. Let's connect in next video to review Active Directory requirements.